The sun had barely risen over the far stretch of the dry plains, when a thin veil of dust floated above the earth, stirred by the hooves of a lone horse. The morning air was sharp and quiet, the kind of silence that wrapped around a man who'd spent too long with only the wind for company. Down by the creek that cut through a patch of cottonwoods, a young farmer filled his bucket, his hands rough and chapped from years of tilling soil that gave little in return. He wasn't a man used to surprises. His days followed the rhythm of the land: sunrise, work, sunset, and the lonesome stillness of night. But that morning something felt different. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. When he lifted his head, he saw her, a figure at the ridge, tall, steady, wrapped in tanned buckskin and shadow. Her hair caught the sunlight like strands of dark river water, and her gaze was fixed on him with quiet fire. She didn't move right away, just watched him the way a hawk studies something it doesn't quite understand. He froze, unsure whether to run, speak, or bow his head. Encounters between settlers and the Apache were rare in these parts, and when they did happen, they seldom ended in peace. But she didn't carry a weapon, only a calm that made him uneasy in a different way. The woman dismounted slowly, her steps graceful, measured. Every movement spoke of control, like she carried the weight of a purpose she wasn't afraid to show. The farmer's heart beat louder with each step she took. He'd heard stories about Apache women, fierce, loyal, and proud, but he'd never seen one up close. When she reached the edge of the creek, she stopped, her eyes meeting his. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the sound of the running water filled the space between them. "You live alone," she said, her English broken but clear. Her voice was low and certain, the kind of tone that didn't invite lies. He nodded slowly. "Yes, just me." She studied his face, then his hands, as if measuring his worth without words. The farmer felt small beneath that gaze. He had faced drought, storms, and the loneliness of the prairie, but he had never faced a woman who looked at him like that. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with something that felt deeper, almost commanding. "My name is not for you yet," she said when he asked. "But I came because I need something." Her words made his throat dry. He tried to find his voice, but before he could ask what she wanted, she took a step closer, her eyes steady. "I want a child from you," she said simply. The world seemed to stop. The wind slowed, the water quieted, and for a heartbeat, all he could hear was the echo of her words ringing through the canyon of his mind. A child, from him. He blinked, sure he had misunderstood. She wasn't smiling. There was no hint of teasing or shame. She spoke as if stating a truth, one already decided in her heart. The farmer stepped back, his breath uneven. He'd spent years alone, not by choice but by circumstance. The women of the nearby town never looked twice at a man with nothing but a dry field and a creaking house. He wasn't the kind to draw attention, and he'd long accepted that his life would pass quietly, like the whisper of wind through wheat. But this was something beyond reason. He stammered. You can't mean that." "I do," she replied firmly. "My people are gone. My tribe scattered. The spirits say the blood must live, or all will be lost." Her words carried the weight of generations. She looked at him not as a stranger, but as a vessel for something sacred. He shook his head, his pulse pounding. "Why me?" Her eyes softened slightly, but her stance didn't. "Because you're kind," she said. "I watched. You gave food to the old hunter by the river. You buried his dog when it died. You did not fear him. You are a man who feels." Her calmness only made his confusion worse. The thought of what she asked tore at every sense of reason he had, yet there was something in her eyes, a deep sorrow, a silent strength, that kept him rooted where he stood. He wasn't sure whether it was fear, awe, or something unnamed. The Apache woman turned her face toward the horizon, her expression unreadable. "I do not ask for love," she said. "I ask for life." He didn't answer. His thoughts tangled like barbed wire. She was unlike anyone he had ever known. Wild, proud, and carrying a grief too old for her years. He could tell she'd seen death, loss, and exile. Something about the way she held herself, chin high, shoulders straight, spoke of someone who had carried the weight of too much silence. The farmer found himself drawn to her story, though she hadn't told it. The land around them was filled with ghosts, soldiers' bones buried beneath the dust, broken treaties, burned camps, and families torn apart. Maybe her request wasn't madness after all. Maybe it was her way of keeping something alive when everything else had been taken. Still, he couldn't bring himself to respond. The thought of being part of such a strange, sacred bargain frightened him. He wasn't a warrior, not a hero. He was just a man trying to keep his crops alive, his small world from falling apart. "I can't give you what you ask," he said finally, his voice low. "It's not right." She looked at him again, her gaze steady. "Right?" she repeated softly. "You speak of what is right. Did your people ask what was right when they burned our homes? When they took our children?" Her tone wasn't angry, it was tired. The kind of tired that comes from losing too much and hoping too little. He felt the sting of her words. His hands trembled slightly as he lowered his bucket into the water. "I'm not like them," he said. "I know," she replied. "That is why I came." The silence that followed pressed heavy between them. The sun climbed higher, painting gold across the creek, but the air felt colder. He didn't know what to say, and she didn't seem to expect an answer. She just turned slowly and walked toward her horse, her movements calm, sure. Before she mounted, she glanced back once more. "I will return when the moon is full," she said. "Think of what I asked." And then she rode away, her figure fading into the pale horizon. The farmer stood frozen, his mind a storm. The echo of her words followed him back to his small cabin. Inside, the walls felt tighter, the air heavier. He couldn't escape the image of her face, the strength, the sorrow, the strange peace in her eyes. That night he couldn't sleep. The crickets sang outside, the fire crackled, but all he could hear was her voice repeating like a whisper carried by the wind. "I want a child from you." Days passed, but the thought didn't fade. He found himself watching the horizon every evening, wondering if she would come. His heart wrestled between fear and something he didn't dare name. He didn't know if it was duty, pity, or an awakening desire to understand her world, the one that had nearly vanished under the boots of men like him. As the nights grew colder, he began to feel that maybe her coming wasn't an accident. Maybe fate had brought her to his land for a reason. Yet every time he tried to reason it out, the same question haunted him. Why him? Why a simple farmer who had nothing to give but his own quiet heart? When the full moon rose, silver and wide above the prairie, he stood outside his cabin staring at the road that led to the ridges. Somewhere beyond those hills, she was riding again, carrying her unspoken purpose. The night wind carried her scent of earth and smoke. He didn't know what he would say when she came back, or if he would have the strength to say no again. The moon climbed higher, and the silence of the plains deepened. He waited, unaware that before dawn, his world and his heart would never be the same again. The night after she left stretched longer than any he had known. The farmer sat by the dying fire, his hands still rough with soil, staring into the glow that flickered like memory. Every crackle of wood sounded like a footstep outside. Every brush of wind against the shutters made him turn. He told himself he wasn't waiting, that he didn't expect her to come again. But deep down he knew that wasn't true. Something inside him had shifted the moment she spoke those words. Her voice still lingered, quiet, steady, and impossible to forget. By morning he went back to his chores. The fields were dry, but he worked them anyway, the way he always did. He pushed the plow, fixed the fence, hauled water from the creek, anything to keep his mind from wandering back to that woman and her strange request. Yet as he worked, her image followed him. Her steady eyes, her calm strength, and that haunting sense of purpose. He didn't understand what she wanted from him beyond what she said, but he knew there was more behind her words than she'd told. No woman would cross those ridges alone just to ask for a child without reason. He thought of the scars she carried, not on her skin, but in the way she held herself. The Apache had suffered greatly. He'd heard stories from travelers, soldiers, and traders, their lands taken, their families scattered, their ways fading with each passing season. Maybe she was the last of her kind, trying to keep her people alive in the only way she knew. That thought stayed with him as he walked the property line. The cabin he lived in was small, built by his father before him. It sat alone between two low hills, surrounded by dry grass and stubborn rocks. His father had died when he was young, leaving him to work the land with more determination than luck. He had once dreamed of a family, a wife, children running through the fields, laughter in the evenings, but time had turned those dreams into quiet acceptance. Until now. As the days passed, the world around him seemed to change in subtle ways. The wind blew colder from the north, bringing the smell of pine and smoke. Coyotes called closer at night. The creek ran lower than usual, but its sound carried louder in the stillness. He began to feel watched. Sometimes, while tending his crops or chopping wood, he would sense eyes on him. Not hostile, just present. Once he found fresh tracks near the barn. They were light, small, and unmistakably human. He knew she was near. One evening, while bringing in the last of the tools before sunset, he saw her again. She appeared on the ridge like before, the setting sun painting her silhouette in gold. He stood still, his breath caught between relief and dread. She came down slowly, her horse moving with the rhythm of the wind. This time she wore a cloak made of woven hides, and her hair was braided with feathers that swayed with each step. He didn't move as she approached. She stopped near the same place by the creek and dismounted without a word. For a moment they only looked at each other, two souls from worlds apart, caught in a silence that spoke louder than words. "You came back," he said finally. "I said I would," she answered simply. "The moon is full," he nodded, unsure what else to say. The weight of her presence made the air feel heavier. She looked around the farm, taking in the fences, the small garden, the old house. "You live here all alone?" she asked. He nodded again. "It's all I've got left." She ran her hand over a wooden post, her fingers tracing the grooves carved by time. "Your people build walls," she said quietly. "Ours build fires. You live behind things. We live around them." He didn't know how to answer, so he said nothing. She turned back to him. "You think I am strange," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "I think you're brave," he said softly. "And maybe a little lost." Her eyes softened just for a second before she looked away. "You cannot understand what it is to lose a world," she said. "When the soldiers came, they said it was peace. But peace was only death that moved slower." Her voice trembled, but she didn't cry. "My people are gone. My brother was taken. My mother died on the mountain. The spirits told me that life must rise again. That is why I came to you." He felt a chill run through him. Her pain was not something he could measure, yet he understood it in a way that reached beyond words. He too had known loss, not of land or tribe, but of hope. The loneliness that sat with him each night was its own kind of death. "You could go to others," he said quietly. "To your own people, maybe." "There are no others," she replied. "Only me." The stillness that followed was deep. The creek shimmered in the dim light and the sound of an owl echoed from the hills. He wanted to speak, to say something that would ease the weight in her eyes, but nothing felt right. She looked toward the cabin. "May I sit by your fire tonight?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, you can." Inside, the warmth of the small fire filled the single room. She sat near it, cross-legged, watching the flames as if seeing old memories there. He placed a pot of stew on the table and offered her some, unsure if she'd take it. She accepted with quiet grace, eating slowly, her movements measured. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was careful, respectful. "You have no wife?" she asked after a while. He shook his head. "No, she died before we married, fever." "I am sorry," she said softly. "You buried her alone?" "Yes," she nodded, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Then you know how it feels to lose something you dreamed of." He met her gaze and nodded again. "Maybe that's why you came," he said. "Maybe," she whispered. They spoke little after that. She told him small things about her people, how they moved with the seasons, how they believed that the earth remembered every footstep. She spoke of the stars as living spirits, and of how each life was a spark that returned to the sky. Her words carried sadness, but also strength. As the night deepened, he realized how much the sound of another voice could ease the weight of silence. Her presence filled the cabin in a way that made it feel less empty. But with that warmth came confusion. He couldn't stop wondering why she had chosen him. Of all men, he wasn't strong or brave or powerful, just an ordinary man surviving one day at a time. When she finally rose to leave, the moonlight poured through the small window, silver against her dark skin. She paused at the door. "You think about what I asked?" she said softly. He nodded, though he hadn't reached an answer. She looked at him a moment longer. "The spirit sent me here," she said. "But if you say no, I will not return again." He watched her walk into the night, her figure blending into the silver grass until she was gone. In the days that followed, the farm felt different again. The air carried her scent, smoke, pine, and something faintly sweet. He found small signs that she'd been near. A feather left on the fence post, a small pouch of herbs hanging by his door. Once he woke in the middle of the night and thought he saw her shadow at the edge of the field. watching silently before fading into the dark. He told himself it was imagination, that his loneliness was playing tricks, but part of him didn't want it to end. The mystery of her presence made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt for years. One morning, while fixing the barn door, he found something resting on the step. A small carving made of bone, shaped like a bird with open wings. He picked it up carefully, running his fingers over the smooth surface. On the back were marks he couldn't read, but he felt their meaning, a promise, or maybe a warning. That night, as the wind howled across the plains, he dreamed of her, standing by the creek, her eyes filled with firelight, whispering words he didn't understand. When he woke, the sound of horses echoed faintly in the distance, fading before dawn. The world around him was shifting, though he couldn't see how. The land, the sky, even the silence seemed to hold new weight. Something was drawing them together, something neither of them could stop. As the next full moon neared, the farmer found himself waiting again without meaning to. He worked slower, looked toward the horizon more often, and listened to the wind as if it carried her voice. He didn't know what he would say if she returned, only that part of him wanted her to. But deep in his heart, he also knew that her coming again might not bring peace, only change. And in the quiet of those long nights, he wondered whether the spirits she spoke of had chosen him for something far greater than he could understand. The next days bled together with the slow patience of the plains, yet each hour carried a faint tremor he could not name. He woke before dawn and walked his rows, checked the dry furrows and listened for the creak the way a man listens for a heartbeat. The sky built wind in the afternoons and the barn door thumped in tired rhythm, but the house felt fuller somehow. He took to setting a second tin cup on the table without thinking. He bundled a loaf he saved from the last bag of flour. He kept a small blanket folded by the hearth where she had sat. He told himself these were only habits forming around a memory, yet they felt like tracks leading toward a life not yet lived. A rumor drifted up from town on the wagon trail. The peddler with the mended hat passed by and said soldiers had been seen far to the south, pushing small camps into the hills. He also said a band of riders had lost cattle near the ridge. The words hung between them like dust. The farmer felt his throat tighten. He knew what such talk could bring. When a calf went missing, someone always paid, and the first blame fell upon those with no voice in town. He asked the peddler if anyone had seen the thieves. The man shrugged and said the tracks were light, hard to read, and then he glanced at the house with a wary eye as if the walls themselves might hold a secret. The farmer paid for a spool of wire and a pouch of nails and watched the wagon creak away. That evening he walked the fence line with a coil over his shoulder and the line pliers at his hip. The grass rubbed his boots and the sky laid pink over the far rim. He found a break near the north corner where the wire had pulled loose. Hoof dents showed in the soft dust, but they were old and shallow. He crouched, ran his fingers over the marks and felt a shiver settle into his spine. The prints were from smaller horses than the ranchers used, light and careful. He thought of her, and then pushed the thought aside. He had no proof of anything. He tightened the wire and watched the light fall and the first star awaken. Somewhere far off, a coyote called and another answered. She came again when the moon was a pale coin. He heard the horse before he saw her, the soft rhythm of hooves woven into the night. She dismounted at the creek and waited until he stepped from the shadow of the cottonwoods. There was weariness in her shoulders, a weight that pulled on the lines of her face, yet her eyes held their steady light. He asked if she had eaten. She shook her head. He handed her bread and a strip of dried meat, and she took them with quiet gratitude, chewing slow, as if each bite carried a memory. When she was done, she opened the small pouch of herbs and laid 3 leaves on the water, letting them drift downstream. He asked what that meant. She said it asked for safe ground. The farmer spoke of the peddler's rumor, of cattle gone missing, of riders with short tempers and quick hands. She listened without moving. When he finished, she said the hills were full of hungry mouths. There were wanderers from broken bands, children hidden by grandmothers, boys who chased game with dull knives. She said some had taken what they needed to live. She said not everyone asked the spirits before they did so. He pressed his lips together and stared at the water. He wanted to ask if she was among them, but he could not force the question across his tongue. She read the thought anyway and answered without anger. She said she would not bring danger to the door of someone who had shown kindness. They went inside and sat near the fire. The house creaked as it did on cold nights, and the flames bent low, tired of dry pine. She told him small pieces of her road. Once there had been a man promised to her, a quiet hunter who wore a band of carved bone on his wrist. He had gone east to seek his brother and never returned. She had waited 2 winters, then the world broke around her like a cracked bowl. Camps burned, elders scattered, and the river that had once held laughter carried only ash. She said the spirits warned her that the line must not end. She said she went to a healer in the mountains, old as the rocks, and the healer told her to find a man whose eyes did not run from pain. She looked across the flames at the farmer and said she had found him. He took those words as if they weighed as much as iron. He still could not give her an answer, but his refusal lost all its certainty. He had lived so long in the quiet shape of his own grief that he had thought there was no space for anything else. Now his small life had grown edges that cut and edges that held. He asked where she slept when she was not here. She said she kept to the trees west of the ridge, near a hollow washed by spring floods, and that she moved often to leave little sign. He asked if anyone knew she came to his place. She shook her head. Her gaze drifted to the window. She said a boy sometimes watched from the hills, a half-grown shadow with quick feet. He did not belong to her people or to the town. He belonged to hunger. She said she had left food where he could find it, more than once. The farmer thought of the missing loaf last week and how he had blamed foxes. 2 days later, a wagon rattled up the trail and stopped near the gate. The visitor was the woman from the mission north of the bend, the one who taught letters to children and brought herbs to the sick. She climbed down with her satchel and waved with a weary smile. He had not seen her in months. She stepped into the yard, her eyes scanning the fence, the garden, the clean sweep under the eaves. She said she had news from town and asked if he had heard the talk. He said he had. She told him the ranchers held a meeting. They planned to ride the ridges at dawn and search for the thieves. The sheriff would join them. She watched his face and then lowered her voice. She said men were easier to move than mountains, but sometimes you could turn them with truth. If he knew anything that could prevent blood, he should say so. He kept his hand still and his voice plain. He told her he knew nothing useful. He asked what she believed. Her mouth tightened. She said blame liked to travel downhill. She had seen the old pattern too many times. Then she pulled out a wrapped bundle, opened it to show a bundle of dried roots and 2 folded cloths. She said they might be needed. She held his eyes and told him to trust the ground more than the noise of men. Before she left, she put a hand on his arm and said that sometimes a story survives not because it is strongest, but because someone chooses to hold it. He stood in the yard after she drove off and watched the dust settle and thought of stories that deserved to live. That night he slept light and woke to the snap of a twig near the barn. He stepped out with a lantern and found the half-grown boy she had described, lean and watchful, eyes bright and wary as a fox. The boy froze in the lantern glow and then coughed like his chest was trying to climb out. The farmer lifted the lantern higher and saw a faded bandana at the boy's neck and a torn sleeve with dried blood. He asked where the boy came from. The boy would not say. He asked if he was hungry. The boy nodded. Inside, the farmer set down bread and stew and waited while the boy devoured both with soft sounds that cut at the heart. When the bowl was empty, the boy's eyes drifted to the small carving of the bird on the shelf. He pointed at it, then at the door, then at the hills, and the farmer understood the message. The boy had seen the Apache woman and knew this was a guarded place. In the morning the boy was gone, leaving only tracks that whirled like smoke in the dust. The farmer followed them a short distance and saw where they turned toward the west hollow. He did not push farther. The day broke cool and slow, but the wind sharpened toward noon. He worked the fence again and repaired what he could, then stacked wood at the door. He kept glancing toward the ridge, expecting riders to appear at any moment. The hours stretched. By late afternoon, he heard them at last. The first to crest the slope was a ranch hand with a red scarf and a shotgun across his lap. Behind him rode 3 others and the sheriff, along with 2 younger men who wore big hats like they did in photographs. They reined in at the gate and eyed the house and yard. The farmer stepped onto the porch with his hands open. The sheriff tipped his hat. He said there had been trouble, that calves were missing and they were following prints that cut across the north trail. He asked if the farmer had seen anyone. The farmer said the land was quiet. He told them he had repaired wire and found old hoof marks. The ranch hand with the red scarf asked if he had seen any strangers, and his eyes were hard and curious. The farmer said a peddler had passed by. The men exchanged looks. The sheriff's gaze wandered toward the creek and lingered. He asked if the farmer had heard stories about an Apache woman moving through the hills. He said some claimed she had been seen near the missions. The farmer felt his pulse pick up and forced his voice to stay level. He said he kept to his ground, that he minded his own work. The sheriff nodded. He said they would ride the West Hollow before sunset and asked if the farmer had any advice about bogs or hidden washes. The farmer pointed toward the stony rise and said to avoid the far gully, where the earth gave way without warning. The sheriff thanked him. The ranch hand watched the farmer's face as if he could read truth like a map. Then the riders moved off, the sheriff last, his hat low against the glare. As the sound of hooves faded, the farmer leaned on the porch rail and breathed the kind of breath a man takes when a storm passes close but not through. He knew the riders would sweep the hollow and likely find nothing. The woman had said she moved often. Still, the search would stir the ground and wake all the quiet things that tried to sleep. He walked to the creek, and as he crouched to drink, he saw the 3 leaves she had set afloat days before caught at the bend. He lifted them out and laid them on the bank like a correction to a prayer. The next time she came, she did not dismount at once. She studied the ground first, then the fence, then the roofline. When she reached him, she said the riders had moved like men who did not know how to see. She said they looked hard at every tree and missed the one shadow they passed 2 times. Her mouth tipped with the smallest trace of humor, but her eyes were grave. She said the boy had led a group of children to a cave while the riders searched. She said the old woman in the cave had no fire left in her hands, only smoke. The farmer listened with his jaw tight. He felt the shape of her story closing around him like weather. He wished he were a man with stronger answers. He asked if the cave had water. She said it had a thin drip that sang all night. The conversation turned and settled, and the distance between them inside the small room became a string pulled taut, humming with what was unsaid. He asked what she wanted besides the request that had started all this. She looked into the fire and answered that she wanted a small piece of earth where no one chased, where children could wake to the sound of birds and not the sound of boots. She said she wanted to plant the old songs where they could take root, mixed with new ones if they must, so long as nothing was done in shame. He looked at his hands, at the scars from wire and shovel and frost, and then at the nail where the small carving hung. He told her he did not know how to make a piece of earth safe, but he would stand in front of his door if anyone tried to take what was inside. Later, after she left, he took out his father's journal from the small chest under the bed. The pages were brown and brittle. He read entries about storms and prices and a harvest that barely filled the bin. Tucked between 2 pages, he found a map drawn in pencil, a careful line marking a stream that used to run strong toward a stand of oaks that no longer lived. At the edge of the map was a note about a spring that held through every summer. He traced the mark and thought of the cave and the drip that sang at night. He folded the paper and slipped it into his shirt. Then he blew out the lamp and lay awake while wind touched the roof like cautious fingers. Morning brought a sky the color of tin and a smell of rain that rarely kept its promise. He was patching the chicken coop when the widow from the far claim came slowly up the trail, a basket on her arm and her boy leading a mule with a sack of feed. She said she had heard riders near the ridge and came by to see if he needed anything. Her eyes were sharp with worry, and the kind of kindness that had a spine. The boy wandered to the shed, found the old slingshot and asked if he could keep it. The farmer said yes, and the boy grinned like a crack of sun through cloud. The widow lowered her voice and said the town had new talk. The rancher with the red scarf swore he had found a woman's prints near the hollow and claimed the tracks led toward the creek. The widow watched the farmer as if she were waiting for him to put down a stone he had carried too long. He thanked her for the feed and asked after her roof. She said the wind had made a mess of the shingles, and then added that sometimes it was better to stand in the rain than to cover a house with the wrong boards. By evening, the first drops fell, and the earth breathed. He set a bucket at the corner to catch runoff, and smiled when the first splash sounded. The creek woke a little. He stepped into the doorway just as a figure broke from the ridge at a run, not on horseback but on foot. It was the half-grown boy, soaked and panting. He stumbled across the yard, grabbed the porch post and gasped out broken words about riders and dogs in a trail found by accident. He pointed west, then south, then clutched his side. The farmer steadied him and looked toward the ridge. The rain thickened. Hoofbeats rolled faintly from the direction of town, a muffled drum under the wet sky. He felt the map in his shirt and the iron weight of choice in his chest. The boy pulled at his sleeve and gestured wildly with his thin hand, then drew a shape in the air that could only mean a cave, and a circle of small bodies huddled within. The farmer's gaze slid to the edge of the field, where the cottonwoods leaned as if listening. He could almost feel the woman's presence in the rain, a steady line of will that refused to bend. He said the boy should drink, then told him to wait by the stove, and then he stepped out into the rain with his hat low and his jaw set. He had not yet given her the answer she asked for, but the land had handed him another question, larger and more urgent, and the riders were nearer now, their shapes just starting to lift against the rim. The rain fell heavier as he crossed the field, the sound of it washing through the silence like 1,000 whispering hands. Each drop struck the soil, raising the scent of earth and old roots. His boots sank deep and his coat clung to his shoulders, but he didn't slow. Behind him, the small cabin glowed faintly, a fragile square of light swallowed by the storm. The boy watched from the doorway, trembling as thunder rolled across the plains. The farmer didn't look back. He followed the faint ridge trail, his breath steady, his heart louder than the wind. He knew the riders wouldn't be far. The distance between the town and the hills wasn't long, and they rode hard when anger burned in their chests. He could already picture their faces, soaked hats, rifles ready, eyes searching for someone to blame. The land had seen that look before. It was the same look his father used to describe from the days when settlers pushed into wild ground, when fear made men do things they later called justice. He tightened his grip on the lantern and pressed on toward the creek that wound toward the west hollow. The night grew darker with every step. Lightning flashed across the sky, showing brief images of the world around him. Broken fences, scattered brush, and the old path leading up toward the ridge. Each flash revealed shapes that disappeared before he could name them. Once he thought he saw a figure standing near the cottonwoods, still and waiting, but when the light faded, there was nothing. The wind screamed through the branches, and for a moment he wondered if the spirit she spoke of were walking beside him. By the time he reached the narrow pass, his legs ached, and his breath came heavy. He paused near a fallen tree, shielding the lantern against the rain. The hollow lay ahead, beyond a curve of rock where the creek deepened into a shadowed pool. Somewhere beyond that, the cave waited, the place she had spoken of where the children hid. The farmer looked down the path and saw new tracks, hooves, several of them fresh in the mud. The riders had already come this way. He bent low, tracing the prints. They led forward, then split, some toward the upper ridge, others toward the lower hollow. He could tell from the pattern they were circling in confusion, unsure which way to turn. He moved faster now, heart pounding. If they found the cave, there would be no talk, only gunfire and fear. He thought of her, the Apache woman, standing between those frightened children and armed men who wouldn't see her as human. The thought lit something fierce inside him, something that felt older than reason. He was not a fighter, not a man of war, but there were moments when a man could not stay silent. This was one of them. As he climbed the ridge, the storm broke for a moment, and the moon cut through the clouds, casting silver light across the valley. From where he stood, he could see faint shapes moving near the hollow. Riders, 5 of them, their torches flickering in the distance. One torch burned brighter than the rest, carried by the man with the red scarf. The farmer recognized him even from afar, the same ranch hand who had questioned him days before, the one whose voice carried bitterness sharper than the rain. The others followed close, rifles slung, searching the trees. He moved down the slope, crouched low, careful not to slip. The ground was slick, but his steps found quiet places between stones. The wind carried his scent away from the riders, and the thunder masked his movement. When he reached the creek, he found a shallow crossing and waded through, the cold biting through his boots. On the far side, the mouth of the hollow opened like a dark wound in the earth. He could see faint light inside, the glow of a small fire, hidden but alive. He called softly once, a low sound between the gusts. There was no answer. Then another flash of lightning lit the sky, and he saw her standing at the mouth of the cave, her bow drawn, her eyes locked on him. For a second, she looked ready to strike until the light revealed his face. She lowered the bow and stepped forward, her hair plastered against her face by the rain. "You should not be here," she said, her voice nearly lost to the wind. "They're close," he said quickly. "They're coming from the ridge." She looked past him toward the north, her jaw tightening. "I know, the boy warned me. There's no time," he said. "You have to move them. The riders are splitting. They'll find this place soon." She glanced back into the cave, where faint shapes huddled in the darkness. Small figures, children, wrapped in animal hides, eyes wide and silent. She shook her head. "They're too weak to move far. One is sick. The rain will kill them." He stepped closer. "Then I'll lead them through the old creek bed. It runs west, toward the spring. The riders won't follow through the mud." Her eyes searched his, unsure. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "They are not your people." "Maybe they should have been," he said. "Maybe it's time someone stood between them and a gun." A shout cracked through the rain, distant but close enough to chill the blood. The riders were coming down the slope, The red scarf caught the light again, brighter this time, moving toward the hollow. She turned sharply, barking something in her own tongue. Two of the older children gathered the smaller ones, helping them to their feet. The farmer took the nearest torch from the ground and smashed it against a rock, snuffing the light. "Move," he said. "I'll take them." She hesitated for only a heartbeat before nodding. Together, they guided the children down the narrow path toward the lower creek. The rain made the rocks slick, and the water roared louder now, swollen with runoff. He carried the smallest child on his back while she led the others, her steps sure even in the dark. Behind them, voices grew louder. The riders were shouting to one another, and the sound of hooves splashing through water echoed like thunder. One voice, harsh and cutting, called out, "We saw the smoke! She's here!" The farmer turned, heart hammering. A rifle fired, the sound cracking through the valley. A bullet struck the rock near his shoulder, spraying fragments into the air. He grabbed the child tighter and ran. The Apache woman spun, loosing an arrow toward the light. A man cursed in pain, and the torch fell, tumbling into the creek. Another shot rang out, closer this time, and she ducked behind a boulder, motioning for the others to keep moving. They followed the bend of the creek until the water deepened. The mud pulled at their boots, but the noise of the storm covered them. The farmer led the group into a narrow cut where the banks rose high on either side. He knew this ground. It was part of the old trail his father had mapped years ago, the one that led to the spring marked on that brittle paper. It wasn't far now, but the riders were closing fast. Lightning tore across the sky again, and in that moment, he saw them. 4 shapes on horseback, their faces hard, their eyes wild with rain and firelight. The red-scarfed man raised his rifle and shouted something he couldn't hear. The Apache woman turned sharply, her bow raised, her figure framed by the flash of light. The air between them held like a held breath. Then thunder swallowed everything. The farmer grabbed her arm and pulled her into the cut. They stumbled through the rising water, the children ahead of them. Another shot cracked the air, and this time the sound was followed by a cry. One of the older boys fell, clutching his arm. The farmer dropped beside him, pressing a hand over the wound. Blood mixed with rainwater and ran down his wrist. "He'll live," the woman said tightly, tying a strip of cloth from her cloak around the boy's arm. Her voice didn't tremble, but her eyes did. They pushed on until the land opened suddenly into a small clearing. The spring. Steam rose faintly from the pool where the earth breathed warmth even in the cold rain. The farmer motioned the children into the shelter of a nearby rock overhang. The woman knelt beside them, whispering in her tongue, calming their fear. Then she stood and looked at him. "You should leave," she said. "If they find you with us, they will not listen." "I'm not leaving," he said. Before she could answer, voices rose again, closer now, only yards away. The riders had found the trail. The glow of torches flickered through the trees. The farmer looked around quickly. The clearing was open, nowhere to hide. He spotted an old fallen log near the edge of the spring, and a patch of brush beyond it that led to a higher ledge. "Get them up there," he said. "I'll draw them off." She caught his arm, her grip strong. "If you go, you may not return." He met her eyes and said quietly, "Neither will they if I don't." For a moment, neither spoke. Rain ran down their faces, washing away the lines of fear, leaving only resolve. Then she nodded once and turned to gather the children, guiding them toward the ledge. The farmer stepped into the open, the lantern in his hand. He lifted it high, letting its light catch the rider's eyes. A shout went up from the trees, followed by the crack of another rifle. He ducked and ran, the lantern swinging wildly, drawing the gunfire toward him and away from the spring. He could feel the bullets hitting mud and stone around him, could hear the riders cursing as they reloaded. His heart pounded so loud it drowned the thunder. He stumbled through the brush, making sure they followed. When he reached the edge of the ridge, he stopped for a moment, panting. Below him, the valley stretched wide, and beyond it lay the faint flicker of his cabin's light. For the first time in years, he thought of that lonely fire as something worth dying to protect. Behind him, the riders broke through the trees, torches flaring, rifles ready. The man with the red scarf pointed and shouted, "There! That's him!" Another gunshot echoed. The farmer turned and ran for the narrow trail that curved around the ridge, the one that led back to the creek crossing. He didn't look back, but he could feel the storm closing in, the hooves pounding the ground behind him, and the air trembling with the weight of what was coming. The night no longer belonged to the sky or the rain. It belonged to the moment between life and death, and both of them were waiting at the edge of the ridge. The wind tore at his coat as he ran along the narrow ridge, his boots slipping on the wet stone. Behind him came the thunder of hooves, the shouts of men too blinded by anger to hear the warning in the storm. The lantern in his hand flickered wildly until a gust tore it from his grip, sending it crashing into the rocks below where it shattered in a burst of sparks. The darkness swallowed him, but he kept going, the rain stinging his face, his lungs burning. He knew the land better than they did. He knew where the ground dipped, where the roots broke through the mud, and where the path turned treacherous. The old map his father had drawn lived in his mind like memory carved into the bone. He had one chance, lead them far enough, and the woman and the children would be safe. A shot rang out, close enough that he felt the wind of it graze past his shoulder. He stumbled, caught himself on a branch, and kept running. The riders cursed behind him. The man with the red scarf shouted something, a voice thick with rage. Then came another shot, then another. He veered off the trail, down the slope where the rocks grew slick and the trees thickened. The horses hesitated at the edge, their hooves sliding on the wet stone. He heard the men shouting to each other, arguing whether to follow. Lightning split the sky, lighting the valley below. For a brief moment he saw it all. The twisting creek, the dark hollow, the faint glimmer of firelight far in the distance. He knew she was there, watching, waiting, praying that he would make it through. He felt his strength begin to waver, but he didn't stop. He forced himself down the slope, half sliding, half falling, until his boots hit soft ground. The water from the creek was cold enough to numb his feet, but it steadied him. He splashed through it, following the bend toward home. The riders circled above, their torches now distant specks. The storm had turned their hunt against them. Mudslides began to pull at their horses, and thunder rolled louder than their rifles. The man in the red scarf cursed the rain, but his voice was fading. The farmer moved quietly through the trees until he reached the old oak that marked the edge of his land. His body trembled from exhaustion, his breath shallow, but he pressed on toward the cabin's faint light. When he reached the clearing, the sight stopped him cold. The Apache woman was there, standing in the doorway, her wet hair clinging to her shoulders, the firelight behind her casting a soft glow. The children were inside, wrapped in blankets, the youngest asleep on the floor. She looked at him with disbelief, then relief, and finally something deeper, a quiet recognition that needed no words. He stumbled toward her, his legs giving way as he reached the steps. She caught him by the arm and helped him inside, her hands steady despite the tremble in her own. He sank to the floor, breathing hard. "They won't come back tonight," he said between breaths. The rains turned the ridge to stone and mud. "They'll wait till morning." She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing the cut on his cheek. "You could have died," she whispered. "Would have been worth it," he said, managing a faint smile. "They're safe now." The room was warm and still except for the sound of the fire. The children slept soundly, their faces calm for the first time in days. The woman sat near him, wrapping a piece of cloth around his arm where a bullet had grazed him. Neither spoke for a long while. The rain eased, and the soft drip of water from the roof was the only sound that filled the silence. When morning came, the sun rose over the plains in a haze of gold. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and sharp. The farmer stepped outside, his body sore but alive. He looked toward the ridge and saw only broken trails where the riders had turned back. The red-scarfed man was gone, his anger washed away by the night. For the first time in weeks, the land felt still again. He turned to see her standing beside him. She had braided her hair, and her eyes were softer in the daylight. "They will come again," she said quietly. "Men like them don't forget," he nodded. "Then we'll be ready." She looked at him for a long moment. "You still haven't answered me," she said softly. "What I asked the first day we met." He met her gaze, his heart tightening. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "I didn't understand what you meant before. I thought you were asking for something I couldn't give." He looked out across the fields, where new green shoots were beginning to rise through the wet earth. "But now I think I do." She waited, silent. "You wanted life," he said. "Not just for yourself, but for your people, for what was lost. I can't change what happened out there, but if a child could be born into both worlds, one that remembers yours and learns from mine, maybe that's something worth living for." The words hung between them, heavy and real. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "A child of two worlds," she said quietly. "One who carries both the fire and the soil," he nodded. "One who belongs to the land, not to the past." For the first time since she arrived, she smiled, a small, weary smile that carried both hope and sorrow. "Then the spirits were right," she said. "They led me to the man who does not turn from pain." The days that followed were quiet but filled with purpose. The children stayed hidden in the hills until the riders left for good. The farmer and the woman rebuilt the broken fence, tended the small garden, and began to restore what the storm had ruined. The land responded as if it too had been waiting. Grass returned and the creek flowed clear again. The air smelled of new beginnings. Sometimes at night, when the wind was soft and the stars burned bright, he would hear her humming old Apache songs by the fire, melodies that carried stories of the earth and sky. The sound filled the cabin with something larger than peace. It felt like belonging. He learned her language in small pieces, and she learned his in return. Their words mixed like the streams that met behind the house, different but moving toward the same river. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a rider came down the trail. It was the woman from the mission. She dismounted slowly, her face cautious but kind. She looked at them both, at the field, at the children playing near the creek. "The town knows you helped them," she said quietly to the farmer. "Some say you lost your mind. Others say you found your soul. Either way, they've decided to leave you be." He nodded. "That's good enough." The woman looked at the Apache beside him and smiled faintly. "You've made this land bloom again," she said. "Maybe that's the only kind of peace that lasts." Then she handed the farmer a small wooden cross. "This was left at the mission," she said, "for protection." The Apache woman took it gently and placed it on the mantel beside her own small bundle of feathers and carved stones. Two beliefs side by side, different but equal, like the people who placed them there. Seasons passed, and the land healed. The children grew strong, running through the grass that once lay dry and lifeless. The farmer's hands, once worn from solitude, now built instead of repaired. The Apache woman, once silent with grief, found laughter again. Her songs filled the valley in the mornings, and her stories of the old ways gave life to every evening. Together they built a home that belonged to neither one world nor the other, but to both. Years later, when travelers passed that way, they would speak of the quiet homestead where an Apache woman and a shy farmer lived side by side, a place where the land was tended with respect, where no one went hungry, and where every child born was taught both prayer and courage. Some said the woman's spirit had healed the man's heart. Others said his kindness had tamed her sorrow. But those who truly knew the story said something simpler, that love had found its way into a place where it had once been lost. And when the wind moved across those plains, it carried two voices together, one soft as rain, the other steady as earth, whispering to the land that life, no matter how scarred, always finds its way back.